It's time now for perspective. In this age of identity politics, how are we meant to navigate and accommodate the numerous elements of who we are? And what does it do to your sense of self to be seen as other in your own country as a result of the colour of your skin, your religion, or your gender? My guest today is Maboula Soumahoro, a Franco-Ivorian lecturer in French diaspora studies at the University of Tours. She's also the author of the book Le Triangle et l'Hexagon in French. The English title is something like Black is the Journey. Thank you so much for coming on to speak to us here at France 24.
Thank you for having me.
Our absolute pleasure. Now, as I just mentioned, your book is called in French Le Triangle et l'Hexagon. For an English-speaking audience not necessarily familiar with that term, what does this mean? What's this title about?
I would say that it's not even for the English-speaking, because the French and the French-speaking have also asked me about this title. So the hexagon is a very common term used to designate France. And the hexagon refers to the European continental part of France. The triangle is more obscure, even for the French, and designates the Atlantic zone, meaning the African continent, Europe, and the Americas. And this is, let's say, an area that the French sometimes leave out of their mind and their national psyche. Right? France is supposed to be located in Europe only, when France, to this day, is to be found in the Atlantic Ocean, in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific Ocean. And when it comes to former colonies, you have also, Africa and Asia. So I think that it was important for me to remind France that it is much larger than what she thinks as a country that she is. And I think it takes us back to the history of France and the history of colonialism, the history of the slave trade and slavery, topics that we don't like to discuss.
Now, your parents are Ivorian. You were born here in France. You've also spent a significant amount of time in the United States.
Yes.
Did you find that your perception of self shifts depending on the country you're in, the context around you?
Exactly. I grew up in France. I was born in Paris. I grew up in France, never feeling French. I was told by my parents that I was Ivorian, that I was Jula, our ethnic group, that I was a Muslim, for instance, and that I did not belong because we were supposed, as all immigrants, or a lot of immigrants at the time, we were supposed to go back home at some point. So home was, in theory, supposed to be the Ivory Coast. This is how I was raised. On the other side, outside of my home in Paris, I was told by friends that I was an immigrant, a second-generation immigrant. We don't say first-generation French, as is the case in the United States, for instance, for children of immigrants who become the first-generation Americans. In France, you're second generation of immigrants, a term that doesn't make any sense because you cannot be a migrant for two generations. I was an immigrant when I left to live in the United States, but not while I was in France. So those two types of discourse, my parents telling me you're not French, and France agreeing with my parents telling me I was not French, I grew up in limbo for a long time, and then I traveled and I went to the United States, where people asked me, where are you from? In other words, where is your home? And then surprisingly to me, I started answering, my home is Paris, my home is France. So the first time I defined myself and understood myself as French was outside of the continent. Was outside of the country, sorry.
And why is it, do you think, that you found it so hard to self-identify as French, having been born in France, having been brought up in France? Is it racism? Is it a lack of knowledge? What is it here in France that you think led to that?
It has to do with both things you mentioned. It's about racism because your color, your body, says that you don't belong. The only reason, the thing that prompts this question, where are you from, is based in your body. It's not the way I speak. You cannot say I have an accent. You cannot say
it's a French Parisian accent, as far as I'm concerned.
Exactly. So thank you for certifying. But so what prompts this question, where are you from? And if people keeps asking you, where are you from, and that they imagine that your origin is outside of the country, what does it mean? It means that your body talks, that your skin color talks, and your skin color and your body talk because of history. And let's look at this history and see how bodies have been categorized and constructed and have acquired meaning. Being white, being perceived as white, being perceived as black, has consequences. So this is an issue of racism. And when I was in the United States, I define myself as French as a matter of fact. That's all. It's just my mother was in France, my brothers and sisters were in France, my friends and my loving ones were more numerous in Paris than in the Ivory Coast, people that I was related to, but that I didn't know that well. And that's it. It's not a love for France. It's just my home, the place that I'm most familiar with, happens to be France.
Do you think that France accepts that it has a race problem?
I don't think France accepts at all, but because we exist, because we think, because we write, and because we act, it would have to, because we are French and we are speaking from within, not without. You cannot endlessly say you're talking about because you're an immigrant or your family is from the Ivory Coast. You cannot also only blame me for spending so much time in the States and saying this is the American education. No, I grew up here. I went to the French school. I belong. I also happen to be a citizen. So we are going to have those conversations in hexagonal France on the basis of the location of France in this larger Atlantic area. So France is not ready, but we are ready simply because we exist. So we're going to have those conversations.
Now, in the United States, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement has exploded in recent years. Can you see something similar happening here in France?
I think the Black Lives Matter is really to be understood in a long genealogy of social movements, civil rights movements. So it's just one of the most recent expressions. But the difference with populations of color in France is that the African-American presence on U.S. soil can be found since 1619. So I'm not saying that African Americans have been more assimilated and accepted. There is a long history of discrimination and legal mistreatment of African Americans, but at least they were on the territory. When it comes to France, the massive presence of populations of color within the hexagon is more recent. So France can still imagine herself as having a new problem, but it's okay. It will deal. France will deal with this issue because, as I said, we simply exist. We were born here, we grow up here, we die here, we are buried here. And what is France going to do?
Now, you've written that you see yourself and your writings as a continuation of the negritude movement that began in the 30s and 40s, specifically here in Paris, among Black, African, also Caribbean writers.
Yes.
It was a sort of protest against the colonial French power.
Yes.
How is that movement still relevant today as far as you see it?
So when I mentioned the negritude movement in my book, I'm saying that I'm updating the negritude movement.
What's new about the way you see it?
The moment, the historical moment. The negritude movement was anchored in the colonial moment. Right now, we're in the post-colonial moment. We are the new citizens. We are not talking for Senegal. We're not talking about the treatment of people from Martinique, Césaire and Senghor. We're not talking about Guyana, Dumas. Right now, we're talking from Paris, from Marseille, from Bordeaux, and we happen to be citizens of this country. We're not talking from outside. So this is let's say, a domestic issue. This is not an overseas issue anymore.
A very important domestic issue at that. Maboula Soumahoro, Franco-Ivorian lecturer in French diaspora studies at the University of Tours and also the author of this book, Le Triangle et l'Hexagone. Thank you very much for coming on to speak to us.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. A reminder now of our top headlines here on France 24. Cruise ship passengers stranded at sea for 2 weeks over fears they could be infected with the coronavirus have disembarked in Cambodia. That as China reports 121 new deaths on the mainland. And the US Senate votes to curtail President Donald Trump's ability to go to war with Iran without first consulting Congress. 8 of Trump's fellow Republicans voting alongside Democrats to pass that legislation.